Hi again and welcome to the next video of the third section, creating a player object. In this video, we'll learn how to create a player object. We've now imported most assets for the twin stick shooter and we're ready to create a player spaceship object, that is the object that the player will control and move around. Creating this might seem a trivial matter of simply dragging and dropping the relevant player sprite from the project panel to the scene, but things are not so simple. The player is a complex object with many different behaviours, as we'll see. For this reason, more care needs to be taken about creating the player. To get started, create an empty game object in the scene by navigating to Game Object, Create Empty from the application menu, and name the object. The newly created object may or may not be centered at the world origin, 0, 0, 0, and its rotation properties may not be consistently 0 across the X, Y, and Z. To ensure a completely zeroed transform, you could manually set the values to 0 by entering them directly in the transform component for the object in the Object Inspector. However, you can set them all to 0 automatically by clicking on the cog icon at the top left corner of the transform component and selecting Reset from the context menu. Next, drag and drop the player dropship sprite in the textures folder from the project panel to the hierarchy panel, making it a child of the empty player object. Then, rotate the dropship sprite by 90 degrees in X and minus 90 degrees in Y. This makes the sprite oriented in the direction of its parent forward vector and also flattened on the ground plane. The game camera will take a top-down view. You can confirm that the ship sprite has been aligned correctly in relation to its parent by selecting the player object and viewing the blue forward vector arrow. The front of the ship sprite and the blue forward vector should be pointing in the same direction. If they're not, then continue to rotate the sprite by 90 degrees until they're in alignment. This will be important later when coding player movement to make the ship travel in the direction it's looking. Next, the player object should react to physics. That is, the player object is solid and affected by physical forces. It must collide with other solids and also take damage from enemy ammo when hit. To facilitate this, two additional components should be added to the player object, specifically a rigid body and a collider. To do this, select the player object, not the sprite object, and navigate to Components, Physics, Rigid Body from the application menu. Then choose Component, Physics, Capsule Collider from the menu. This adds both a rigid body and collider. The collider component is used to approximate the volume of the object, and rigid body component uses the collider to determine how physical forces should be applied realistically. Let's adjust Capsule Collider a little because the default settings typically do not match up with player sprite as intended. Specifically, adjust the direction, radius and height values until Capsule encompasses the player sprite and represents the volume of the player. By default, the rigid body component is configured to approximate objects that are affected by gravity and fall to the ground, bumping into and reacting to other solids in the scene. This is not appropriate for a spaceship that flies around. Consequently, the rigid body should be adjusted. Specifically, remove the Use Gravity checkmark to prevent the object from falling to the ground. Additionally, enable the Freeze Position Y checkbox and the Freeze Position Z checkbox to prevent the spaceship moving and rotating around axes that are undesirable in a 2D top-down game. Excellent work! We've now configured the player spaceship object successfully. Of course, it still doesn't move or do anything specific in the game. This is simply because we haven't added any code yet. Next, we'll make the player object respond to user input.